President Trump's sweeping 10% tariff on goods from every country has come into force in the last hour. The fallout from the import taxes prompted sharp falls on stock markets around the world. US and UK markets suffered their worst week since COVID. Well, the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, is spending the weekend speaking to foreign leaders about how to avoid what Downing Street has called an all-out trade war. Our North America correspondent David Willis reports.
The closing bell bringing to an end a tumultuous week on Wall Street, one that has seen trillions of dollars wiped off share prices around the world. Rictus grins from those on the trading floor, greeting a market meltdown of the kind not seen since COVID.
China, 67%. That's tariffs.
It was retaliation from the country at the top of Donald Trump's list, the one with whom the United States has the largest trade deficit, that prompted this second day of sell-off as China hit back with 34% tariffs of its own. On his Truth Social platform, the president accused the Chinese of panicking. China played it wrong, he wrote. Earlier, doubling down on his controversial trade policy with an all-caps message that read, "To the many investors coming into the United States and investing massive amounts of money, my policies will never change. This is a great time to get rich, richer than ever before." Not a sentiment shared by the chairman of America's central bank, the Federal Reserve, who delivered a softly spoken warning of inflation rather than prosperity.
While uncertainty remains elevated, it is now becoming clear that tariff increases will be significantly larger than expected. And the same is likely to be true of the economic effects, which will include higher inflation and slower growth. The size and duration of these effects remains uncertain.
10% tariffs on all imports into the US came into effect overnight, with higher so-called reciprocal levies on goods from certain nations set to follow next week. Analysts warn the measures could slow economic growth and lead to a global recession. If that, or the stock market turmoil, is worrying President Trump, he isn't letting it show. He spent the day at his Florida golf course, defiant in the belief that his Liberation Day announcement will indeed make America wealthy again. David Willis, BBC News, Los Angeles.
And a little earlier I spoke to David and he's been telling me what the mood was like in Washington.
Very staunchly positive, and on the golf course today, in fact, Frankie, out of view from the public, but sending off missives on his Truth social media account, basically saying that he has no intention whatsoever of changing course and criticising China's decision to impose those 34% tariffs on imports into the country, basically saying that the Chinese, in his words, panicked in doing so. I think the big thing now is what will follow this as far as other nations are concerned. The EU and Canada are said to be considering their options. Other nations, the UK and several others around the world, are tending to favour the prospect of negotiation in the hope of getting a long-term trade deal out of this with the United States and, of course, a lifting of those punitive trade tariffs. But as you said, President Trump on the golf course today, basically maintaining that nothing here to see, nothing to worry about. These are just teething problems, as he put it, so far.
It is interesting to hear. But of course, businesses will be reacting in the US. Are we hearing from many of them at the moment? Are there any for these tariffs, against these tariffs?
You know, there's a lot of concern that there are certain sectors, the agriculture sector in particular, that could be very harmed by these tariffs that have been imposed by China. There are a lot of people, of course, as well, who have their livelihoods tied up in that sector. And we're seeing some disquiet on the part of Republican lawmakers, not publicly, nobody's broken ranks yet, to criticize Donald Trump over these measures, but disquiet is being expressed that this could, of course, have an impact on certain Republican constituencies where the impact, frankly, could be devastating. So I think there's a lot of hope amongst Republicans that these are not measures that will remain in place indefinitely, rather that they will act as a sort of cudgel, as a lure, if you like, to get foreign governments, America's trading partners, back to the negotiating table and back to hammering out new trade deals, Frankie.
And David, just really quickly, tariffs, of course, mean tax. So obviously concerns prices will start rising where you are. How are people feeling, general consumers feeling? Maybe it is too early to tell at the moment.
I think there is a lot of concern, and analysts here are saying that prices will rise and that they will rise pretty quickly, probably in the next few days or so, certainly over the next few weeks. And that, of course, really could have an impact politically as well as economically.
David Willis speaking to me a little earlier on. Well, the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, is spending the weekend calling Western allies as he considers how to respond to President Trump's tariffs. Here's our political correspondent, Harry Farley.
Well, Sir Keir Starmer believes we're now in a new era, his spokesman saying that the economic landscape is shifting and we need to shift with it. The question is what that shift means in practice for you and me. I think we can expect to hear more from the Prime Minister on Monday about how he intends to respond to these tariffs from Donald Trump. The Downing Street saying that he'll make an intervention then. But speaking to sources across Whitehall, there are a couple of hints of what that might look like. Firstly, we can expect the government to offer some kind of relaxation, some kind of flexibility around the rules for car manufacturers to produce electric vehicles. Remember, car manufacturers hit by huge tariffs of 25% of importing into the US, and so some extra flexibility on meeting the targets to phase out petrol and diesel vehicles we can expect to hear next week. We can also expect to hear some measures around planning reforms, extra measures to try and ease the restrictions on building in the UK. The government has said it is willing to retaliate to these tariffs from Donald Trump. But remember, that's not plan A. Ministers are very much hoping to secure an economic deal with the US that might mitigate or reduce those tariffs in some way. The question is what the UK might have to offer the US, what extra the UK might have to offer the US in order to get that economic deal. Those are all questions that remain unanswered, and I think we'll be posing those to the Prime Minister going into next week.
Harry Farley there. Well, as we've been hearing, China says it will retaliate against the US tariffs. It will impose a 34% tax on US goods due to take effect from the 10th of April. Here's our China correspondent, Stephen McDonnell.
Well, Beijing is certainly taking it right back up to Donald Trump following his tariffs. There had been a view that the Chinese government might hold off for at least a little bit with a view to cutting some sort of a deal. Xi Jinping has obviously decided there is no deal to be cut, certainly not in the near future and certainly not to China's liking. So why not reveal these resolute countermeasures that have been promised? Well, the countermeasures, they're disastrous for every US company wanting to sell into this huge market, especially bad for the US ag sector. Now remember, they already had 10 or 15% tariffs on them from China's last response to the last round of Trump tariffs on this place. Now you're adding 34% on top of that. It's essentially cutting most of them out of this market, and that's striking right into Donald Trump's heartland, and that can't be an accident. The rest of the world, though, is looking at the superpowers. They're at each other's throats, and economists are warning this could spread around the globe, causing potentially catastrophic damage to the world economy. Now, maybe China could find new trading partners, China and Europe, China and Canada, new pathways which are cutting the US out of the loop because of its trade barriers. That's going to hurt US companies and US consumers even further. But we are definitely in uncharted territory here, and I think most observers would say we're just going to have to wait and see where the chips fall before deciding just how bad this could get.
Our China correspondent Stephen McDonald there. Well, Kelvin Lam is a macroeconomist who specialises in Asian markets at Pantheon Macroeconomics, and he told me what impact these tariffs could have.
I think generally for China, that I cover most, the economic impact of the tariff is huge. We expect China's GDP growth to hit about 4% in 2025. We got it downgraded. And for over a 3-year horizon, we're expecting GDP to fall by 2.5 percentage points because of the US tariff. In terms of what hits most, I think certainly export-oriented manufacturing sector, because there will be less demand, US demand for Chinese goods at a higher import price, particularly medium tech durable goods. And also I see manufacturing investment in China will stall because of rising trade policy uncertainty. I mean, China's excess capacity issues for certain products will also worsen. So producer price deflation will probably linger for longer in China. And most importantly, China will probably speed up the structural change of its economy to more domestic demand-led, away from exports. So you will see more fiscal and monetary stimulus or policies from China going forward to prop up demand, facilitate that shift going forward.
And of course, China is putting its own reciprocal tariff on the US, and we're hearing talks of global trade wars, the two largest economies at loggerheads, so to speak. How likely do you think that could be?
Yes, I think actually I agree that we are seeing an escalation of trade war between the two biggest economies in the world. I mean, if you look at the latest couple of months, the last couple of months when the US slapped a total of 20% tariff on Chinese goods, China's response was more muted before and very targeted at energy and agricultural products from the US. But this time it seems to be different because China responded with a sweeping 34% universal tariff on all American imports. And the scope of retaliation, that goes beyond goods is more. So, more rare earth got export bans and more probes on US company and exports. But China probably knows Trump's escalate to de-escalate negotiation tactics. So the aggressive response is probably aimed at providing China with more bargaining chips when they join the negotiating table with the US later. And I think that, also China knows both tariffs and retaliation reduces welfare through misallocation of resources. Everyone is worse off in the process. But China probably wants to wait a bit longer before going onto the negotiating table with the US, because the self-harming US tariffs will slow US growth more, and that reduces US advantage positions to negotiate.